The island of Sodor has always been known as a magical and peaceful place. It's the home of the worldwide famous Thomas the Tank Engine, as well as all of his friends. Thomas is an E2 class tank engine, with 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, dome, boiler, and cobalt blue paint. All of Thomas's brothers were sent to the scrap heap, and he was lucky enough to have been purchased by Sir Topham Hatt to come work on Sodor, which acts as a safe haven for steam engines. However, there was one brother that Thomas didn't know about, and unfortunately, he would find out about him in the worst way possible. A long time ago, there was a tank engine waiting at Brendam Docks to take some passengers home. His shape and basis were similar to Thomas, except he was silver, with the number 0 on his side tanks. He was called Timothy. He was an old but kind engine, with a broad smile and wrinkles on both sides of his face. He simmered happily as his passengers climbed aboard. Soon the last door on the coach closed and the guard blew his whistle. "Full steam ahead, Timothy!" Timothy was soon steaming down the countryside, with the rails humming and the coaches clattering quietly behind him. The moon was full, and all the signals were down. Soon they approached Dryhouse Station, but then it happened. The driver applied the brakes, but nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. Without working brakes, Timothy shot right past the station without stopping. He began to go faster and faster. "Timothy, what are you doing?" But Timothy didn't reply. He just kept on going. Suddenly they were switched off of the main line. Then the driver noticed that they were headed straight towards a cliff, where a viaduct was due to be built. "Timothy, don't! You'll kill us all!" The next morning, workmen arrived to start construction on the viaduct, and found the remains of Timothy and his coaches, along with the bodies of the driver and fireman. There were no survivors. Soon the police arrived, but there wasn't much evidence to accurately determine what had happened. So in the end, they wrote down the cause of the crash as failed or old brakes. Timothy and the coaches were taken to the scrapyard, and the people killed were laid to rest in a nearby cemetery. A few years later, Sir Bertram Topham Hatt took over the railway and purchased an E2 tank engine from the mainland to shut trucks and coaches for the big engines around the yard. That little tank engine would eventually become the most famous number 1 engine of all time. When Percy and Toby came to the railway, they became friends with Thomas, although the other engines seemed skeptical of them at first, but they eventually warmed up to them. Then, in the fall of 1987, Percy told Thomas and Toby a ghost story that his driver had told him, supposedly a made-up ghost story on television. Thomas didn't believe Percy, but the little green engine paid him out after his run-in with a cart of lime. Thomas was cross at first, but eventually the two made up. However, there was more to that story than Percy or his driver knew about. Back in 1914, a year after Timothy's accident, construction on the viaduct was nearly complete. No one knew about the tragic accident that had happened, and the construction was pretty normal at first. A few nights after construction was complete, a couple of workmen were eating a late-night snack before heading home after a long day's work. The moon was full, and a thick fog had settled along the rails. Suddenly, their engine began to whistle frantically. The workmen scrambled to their feet, just in time to see a ghostly-looking tank engine race across the viaduct whistling fit to burst. Before the workmen could even react, the engine was gone. The men were horrified, and quickly reported their encounter to the police. But the police dismissed their claims as just drunken delusions of grandeur. That is, until other people came forward with the exact same claims. Legend says that every year on the date of his accident, Timothy's ghost runs again as a warning to others, plunging into eternal darkness and shrieking out like a lost soul. It all started as any other normal day. All the engines were working very hard. But none of the engines knew about Timothy's dark and untold story until a few nights ago. One evening, the Fat Controller came to Timothy's sheds with a special job for Percy. Percy chuffed anxiously through the thickening fog. He doesn't like traveling to Maithwaite at night. The line passes through a junction next to a spooky old quarry mine. Percy hoped the signal at the junction would be green. He didn't want to stop next to the mine, but the signal was red. He had to stop. Percy looked over to the mine. The thick fog and foreboding darkness made it look very spooky. Percy waited and waited. The signal was only red for a few minutes, but for Percy, it felt like hours. Suddenly, he heard an unfamiliar whistle. Percy was so scared, he steamed away as fast as he could. After Percy delivered the flower bushes to Lower Tidmouth, he returned back to the sheds. All the engines were already fast asleep, but Percy was still thinking about his terrifying encounter with the mysterious engine. The next morning, the engines were getting ready for their morning jobs, but Percy was still scared about last night. Thomas couldn't help but notice. The engines were shocked, especially Thomas and Percy. Later that day, Diesel was sent to work at the docks, while Henry went to work at the quarry with Mavis. When the Fat Controller sees how good I am, he'll get rid of steam engines once and for all. Grease and oil. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. That night, Diesel was shunting trucks at the quarry. Mavis had been asked to deliver some stone to the docks, so Diesel was all alone. He normally didn't mind, but something about this night made him feel uneasy. Oh, bother, why does the weather hate me so much? Oh, I don't like this. Huh? Who's there? Oi! Whoever's out there, knock it off! I'm not in the mood. Thomas? If that's you, I swear to God I'm gonna dunk you in the ocean. What the heck was that? Elsewhere on the island, Gordon was pulling the evening express. He was looking forward to a drink and a rest at the next station. Gordon was furious. The next day, Gordon's fire wouldn't start, no matter what the firelighter did. The other engines quickly noticed that Gordon didn't look like his normal boastful self. He looked scared and upset. When the Fat Controller arrived to find out what the matter was, Gordon said nothing about the encounter he had with Timothy's ghost. The Fat Controller had no choice but to assign Henry to express duty until Gordon snapped out of it. There was no reply. The engines were too shot to say anything, and Thomas was too upset to answer. Later that day, the Fat Controller sent Thomas to pick up a special to deliver to Dryall Airfield. As he was getting ready to leave, Percy puffed in. A few days later, Gordon had recovered from his ghostly encounter with Timothy and was soon back to pulling the express. The other engines were glad to see that he was all right. All throughout the day, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about his forgotten brother. Like Percy, Thomas liked running at night. The air was cool and crisp, and he enjoyed the peace and quiet. But that soon changed. The fog came down, and made it very hard for Thomas to see where he was going. As Thomas neared the viaduct, thoughts of Timothy swirled around in his smoke box. Thomas was halfway across the viaduct when suddenly he heard a ghostly whistle, followed by an unfamiliar voice. For the next 4 weeks, Timothy's ghost continued to haunt the railway, which caused fewer tourists to visit the railway. They began making travels using road and air. With less passengers coming to the railway, the Fat Controller had to take Thomas off of branch line duty until something changed for the better. But a few more weeks passed, and nothing changed. Soon the Fat Controller was left with a drastic decision to make: close the railway or go bankrupt. With the impending threat of their home closing down, Thomas, Percy, and Toby began making plans to put an end to Timothy's reign of horror. Nighttime soon swept across the island. The moon was full, and the stars twinkled like little flashlights. Soon the fog came down thick and fast. Thomas, Percy, Toby, and Edward had split up in order to look for Timothy. Percy was nervously waiting at Brendam Docks, the very last place anyone ever saw Timothy alive. While he waited, the fog grew thicker, making the already spooky docks even spookier. A few weeks later, the Fat Controller came to the sheds with great news. The engines were thrilled. For the following month, Thomas, Percy, and Toby delivered stone to the workmen who were fixing the viaduct. But they couldn't figure out why the Fat Controller hadn't found out about why the viaduct had been destroyed. Then, a few months later, the construction was almost complete. Thomas arrived with the last of the stones to find the Fat Controller surveying the construction.